Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with author Maryjean Wall. Maryjean Wall served as the turf reporter for the Lexington Herald-Leader for 35 years. She holds a PhD in American history from the University of Kentucky and is the acclaimed author of How Kentucky Became Southern and Madam Bell, Sex, Money, and Influence in a Southern Brothel. Her newest book is She's the Mother of Us All, Sweet Evening Breeze in the Queer Community of Lexington, Kentucky. The book traces the life and legacy of Sweet Evening Breeze, examining her place at the intersection of race, gender, and power in the American South. Welcome to the podcast, Maryjean.
I'm so glad to be here, David. Thank you very much for asking me. I've enjoyed doing a podcast with you previously, and I'm looking forward to having a lot of fun doing this.
Yes, I'm really excited to be talking to you. So just to get started, for listeners who may not be familiar, who was Sweet Evening Breeze, and how did you first encounter their story?
Those are two excellent questions. Sweet Evening Breeze, some people would call her a character. I don't want to demean her that way. She was a person of much celebrity who used to make daily appearances in Lexington on the main thoroughfare, which before New Circle Road was South Limestone, where it meets North Limestone and Main Street. And people were so accustomed to seeing her. And she would usually be headed from her job as head orderly at Good Samaritan Hospital on South Lime to the place that's now known as the Bar Complex, 224 East Main Street. And how did I become interested in her? She was the first person pointed out to me when I arrived in Lexington in 1966, I think it was, and I came as a foreign student, so that meant I got a pickup by hosts at the Bluegrass Airport, then called Bluegrass Field. And so they were driving me from the airport back to University of Kentucky to settle me in my dorm, which was Keeneland Hall, and it's no longer there, but it was at the north end of campus next to Good Samaritan Hospital. And we were turning into this lane that led up to the front entrance of Keeneland Hall, and there on the street was this person wearing white uniform, I guess is the best way to describe it, and he had black hair slicked down on his head. And the people driving me in the car said, "There's our town character." And I went in the dorm and forgot about him, except every day on the street because I didn't have a car. If I was walking towards downtown where all things were happening in Lexington, I would pass him on the sidewalk. And he was a real gentleman. He would get off the sidewalk to let me pass. And that was it.
And then was it later that you encountered Sweet Evening Breeze, that persona? Was it much later, or?
I think he might have been identified to me by that name, by my sponsors, my hosts, coming from the airport to Keeneland Hall. But I knew who he was when I passed him on the street all the time, but I didn't know what he did or why they called him that. And eventually, I forgot about him. I moved out of the dorm, started living in different apartments, eventually got an automobile, and was so focused on getting my bachelor's degree and getting started in my career in journalism that I didn't give him any more thought until COVID.
Well, that leads into my next question, because you began working on this book during the COVID pandemic, and it's kind of personally fun for me because I was working in the Kentucky Room at that time, and that's how I got to know you, through talking to you about your research. And so what led you to start this project at that time?
Well, We all had a lot of time on our hands back in the lockdown year, 2020, I think it was. And I don't know, in just sitting around, my brain often gets whirling around in different directions. Like these ideas come to me as a
Mhm.
writer, and I thought, Sweet Evening Breeze, that's something that I haven't touched in writing about our local history, and nobody else has either. And or not to much extent anyway. So I thought maybe I could do an article for Oxford American. It would be right in their wheelhouse. Old Southern black man who controls the town, which he
Mhm.
did, and how he was treated and things like that. Well, they sat on my query letter for a year, then informed me they weren't interested. And I thought, okay, this is too good, this stuff I'd already unearthed on sweets in that COVID year. I can't let it die. I will write a book, and I am sure I can get it published, which was a long other story. But that's what got me going because very little had been written about Sweets, but what had been written made him seem like an intriguing character. And I got to know Bob Morgan and Dr. Jonathan Coleman. He was a colleague of mine in grad school, even though he's much younger than I am. I went to grad school late in life. So I got talking to them about it, and it was still during the lockdown, I believe. I said, I wouldn't be stepping on your toes if I wrote a book about sweets, would I? Dr. Coleman said no, because he's planning on writing a book about queer Lexington. So, with their blessing, I went full steam ahead with research, and that's how this thing got going.
Why did you think it was important to tell this story at this time?
I think it's a really good example, the life of Swedes, that power does not reside exclusively at the top of society.
Hmm.
That's one of the main themes in this book. Sweets was on face value nowhere near the top of society. He's an LGBTQ man or woman. I don't know what he was, and nobody else does either.
Mhm.
And we'll get to that later. He was African American. And in the 1960s, when I came to town, that's two strikes against you right there. How many more are you going to be allowed?
Mhm.
But he built up networks of power in this community. And I became fascinated with the fact that he did. He could tell the mayor how to run the city. He did. And if he needed a ride, he called the police and asked for a cruiser to be sent to give him a ride. This actually happened. So if somebody who's Black and LGBTQ has that kind of ease of slipping through society's many layers and going right to the top, the question that drove me is, how in the heck did he do this? And why did he do it? But
Mhm.
he was doing it. And that's what we need to know. That's why I think this book is important. And also, it sheds some light on what it was like to be LGBTQ and Black
Mhm.
back through the decades that stretched from, let's say, 1920 through the late 1970s. It wasn't easy for either. So I'm fascinated with how he manipulated people. And in terms of what that does for the readership, for all of us, is the lesson in power that he gave us.
Mhm. And as you mentioned a moment ago with your story of arriving to Lexington, if you talk to many lifelong Lexingtonians,
Hmm.
many will recall anecdotes like that about Sweet Evening Breeze. This type of history is usually very difficult to research. So, what kinds of resources did you rely on, and what kinds of challenges or surprises did you encounter?
Okay, I remember I started with U.S. Census records, and Dr. Jonathan Coleman had already done a good bit of work on Sweet Evening Breeze in the census records. that just got me started. I was really curious where he came from, who his family was, and things like this. And from the records and then later newspaper articles, which you led me to, David, I learned that his father was a deacon in his church in Georgetown, pretty commendable, and that sweets, this was the first of the myth busting I encountered. Sweets did not get dropped off on Good Sam's hospital steps by his uncle in Lexington when he was a young child,
Mhm.
and he was not raised in the hospital. That story got started, and people still believe it. People, older people especially, who were vaguely familiar with sweets. I found from the census, and Dr. Coleman had also found this, that he was at home until he was a teenager, probably in his mid-teen years.
Mhm.
The census tells us that. So I don't know how this story got started, but Sweets might have started it herself. And I'll keep switching pronouns
Mhm.
here. Just an explainer I'll give you right now is the older generation in Lexington always referred to Sweets as he. The current generation of LGBTQ refers to Sweets as she.
Mhm.
I notice you use the they pronoun. I don't think there's a wrong pronoun in
Mhm.
this because we don't know what we're dealing with.
There's some really delightful anecdotes from those newspaper articles.
Oh,
Like, there's things where and I mean, that's one of the things you get in old newspapers. There was like I think there was one where she got a new phone line or a new party line. Can you think of some other examples?
well, about that phone number, here's how an historian looks at that. That was like a one-liner, I think,
Mhm.
and they gave the phone number.
Mhm.
I put it in the book, so in case anybody's looking for a password, they could use it.
Uh-huh.
But here's the thing about that, that an historian looks at that item on face value, it's very simple, just saying, "Well, she got a new phone, here's the number." But an historian sees in that she had enough standing in this community
Mhm.
that they acknowledged or took notice of her getting a new phone number.
Mhm.
And I don't know why that was so important other than it indicates to me status. Maybe people wanted to call her, I don't know. But it's more than just saying, like, "You, David Bryant, changed your phone number and here's the new number," because you didn't have Sweets' status in the community.
Mhm.
It told me a lot to read that one thing, and that's how you have to look at these old records. You have to interpret them, contextualize in their own times. So the phone number incident, oh, I was delighted to read about that, and there were others, many others, and a lot of them were docked in the colored notes section, which I should talk about if
Mhm.
you would like me to.
Sure.
All right. Colored notes was embarrassingly where all news concerning African Americans went in the Herald Leader and other Southern newspapers before they finally came to their senses in maybe the 1970s. And the Herald Leader has apologized in print for its treatment of African Americans and all their news for decades and decades. We ignored, when I say we, I mean the Herald Leader, I still see myself as part of them. We ignored the coverage of the civil rights movement, and that was the big thing they were apologizing for. There was civil rights movement, grassroots movement going on in Lexington. At the time, it was all over United States, or at least Southern United States, and you wouldn't know it by reading the Lexington Herald Leader.
Mhm.
That was a big thing for that paper to turn around from the way it previously looked at all news about African Americans had to go in this column called colored notes. Unless it was like a major killing or major robbery, then it would be on the front page if
Mhm.
it was something bad. But there was a woman named in my time at the newspaper named Gertrude Marbley, and she was the compiler of colored notes, the writer of colored notes, and she would bring in every night to the newspaper her pages of typed news that she was thinking should go in that column. She would put it in a specially reserved basket for her pages on top of a file cabinet, and she'd leave. How sad was that? She essentially was a reporter for the Herald
Mhm.
Leader, even though she wasn't working for the company. She was freelance. But she didn't even get to mingle in the newsroom.
Mhm.
And similarly, Sweets was always making it into the newspaper, but not in the main part of the paper,
Mhm.
except for on a couple of occasions. So any news about him was in colored notes,
Mhm.
and some of this news was fascinating.
Do you think Gertrude Marbley had some sort of relationship, the new
Um,
Sweets,
the
or
Sweets era preceded her pretty
Okay.
much.
Okay.
Or there might have been a minor overlap, but Sweets he had a relationship with whoever was doing it before because
Mhm.
his name constantly was in colored notes,
Yeah.
and that takes between journalist and news source a relationship. It's
Mhm.
back and forth. You're giving the journalist interesting copy to put in the column,
Mhm.
and the journalist is giving you space in the column. It's a really, back and forth thing. So I think knowing Sweets, what I've learned about Sweets, he had developed a relationship with some journalists back then.
What do you want to say about the title of the book, She's the Mother of Us All?
Well, that's how the artist Henry Faulkner referred to Sweet Evening Breeze, and I didn't send this manuscript to the publisher with a title, or I
Mhm.
might have had a couple of sample titles that I
Mhm.
knew were very weak. I'm not a good writer of
Mhm.
titles or headlines. And I told them I'd be completely amenable to whatever they came up with, and they did come up with
Mhm.
something, which is the title of the book, She's the Mother of Us All. They told me they found this in the book, it's in there about Henry calling her that, and to me, it's a very meaningful phrase that Henry Faulkner used. I should explain that I've learned this since I started researching. There are gay mothers, gay grandmothers, and Henry was the gay son of Sweet Evening Breeze. And when he said she's the mother of us all, unfortunately, Henry's no longer with us so that I can ask him what he meant. But here's my interpretation of that. She had something to give every one of us, whether we're LGBTQ or not,
Mhm.
whether we're black or white or brown. She gave us all a lot. And whether it was inspiration, lessons in how to manage life, lessons in how to beat the system.
Mhm.
And so I like that title a lot. And then the subtitle is Sweet Evening Breeze and the Queer Community of Lexington, Kentucky. And I've already been asked, can you tell us about the queer community? Well, not really, because I'm not gay, but I've certainly spent a lot of time interviewing gay people for this book, and some of my really good friends are gay. And all I know about the community is how it related to Swedes. That's all I can put in this book. I can't dream up everything about or anything about it. I'm not a fiction writer. I'm an historian. So everything has to be nonfiction in here. But the more I researched about her and the more stories I gathered about her and the things I was able to check out in the records, you get a sense of what Lexington was like at the time
Mhm. Mhm.
and queer Lexington, what it was like.
Yeah, and Lexington was a bit of a regional draw for gay life, correct?
Yes, I've been told this by
Mhm.
numerous people.
And in the book, you address some surprising connections with the, queer community and with areas of Lexington like the horse
Mhm.
industry and University of Kentucky sports. Do you wanna talk about some of
Sure,
those?
that's at the heart of the book,
Okay.
that Sweets was able to ingratiate herself to these varied other communities in Lexington. And let's start with the horse community. They're not all in the horse community partied with her, but there were some
Mm.
very unconventional persons who were big names in the horse community did party with her. And why did this happen? I've been told by descendants of two of those families at least that their fathers were not gay, but they liked that non-conforming lifestyle, that freewheeling, artistic lifestyle that they could find at 224 East Main,
Mhm.
where Sweets went all the time. And they just were unconventional people themselves, so they liked to be part of that. Again, there's a lot of people in the horse industry, hardworking people. It's a very tough, demanding line of work, and they would not have been found at 224 East Main, but I'm talking about the party crowd,
Mhm.
and they were there and mixing. So you had straight and gay mixing there, and that tradition is carried on today because Joseph Berkshire, who owns the bar complex, has stated that to me, that we're not exclusively gay. You want to think that because of the history at that address, but no, straights are welcome there. And the more I looked into the history of that place, straight people always could have gone there,
Mhm.
and some of the horse industry did. Now, what does it mean that Sweets became entwined in the horse world? Well, that was the source of power in this community.
Mhm.
Again, she was working and developing another power source. She was so good at that. And other LGBTQ who came to Lexington, a lot out of the mountains of eastern Kentucky, came down here thinking they would have maybe a freer lifestyle. That's debatable, but they came here. And then all the rich people moving in here in the 1920s and 30s, the horse industry was under a renewed rise of enthusiasm to have racing stables, partly, I think, because of the success of Man of War, who raced in 1919, 1920. Everybody who had money wanted another Man of War.
Mhm.
And it never happened, of course, but that drew them in to buy these horse farms, and there was the myth of the Southern plantation lifestyle that was associated with the horse farms. Even though Kentucky was never of the Deep South, they portrayed it as such, and people who could afford it could buy a piece of that myth.
Mhm.
And they sucked it up, they believed it. My first book is all about that. Anyway, a lot of these rich people either found local LGBTQ people to work for them on their horse farms or whatever, or they imported their own people.
Mhm.
And an excellent example of a local man who was gay, who got a huge boost in his career, was Timothy Johnson, a well-known hairstylist. He used to cut my hair. I'm that old. He's deceased now, and I wish he weren't because I would love to have talked to him about this. But Elizabeth Arden, the cosmetics mogul, she discovered Timothy. He was working at one of the downtown department stores in the hair salon, and she hired him away and installed him after training him in New York as manager of one of her Red Door salons, and she opened a Red Door salon in downtown Lexington. Lexington was so small, such a stick-in-the-mud community back
Mm.
in the 30s,
Mhm.
40s, even 50s, that the idea of a Red Door salon of Elizabeth Arden's here is ludicrous. But, I mean, she'd opened salons in Paris and Palm Beach, places like that.
Mhm.
But here we had one in Lexington, and Timothy Johnson was running it and the head hairstylist there. But he didn't cut Elizabeth Arden's hair there. She would have him go out to her farm, which was on Newtown Pike. It's now UK research land. But she would have him come out there and he'd fix her hair when she was in town. She came here a lot to buy horses and to see the race horses. And she told him one day, "Let's have tea," after he did her hair. And she said, "You don't know how to pour tea. I'm going to teach you." And she did.
Mhm.
And Timothy's partner told me that it's an example of how the wealthy would come into this town and appreciated the services that the LGBTQ community could provide, artistically especially. You needed chefs, creative chefs on these horse farms. You needed event planners. They didn't call them that back in the day, but you needed that. You needed hairstylists. You needed, I don't know, all kinds of trappings that go with wealth. And they either brought their own people again who inevitably were LGBTQ in this line of work, or they reached into the Lexington community and hired people. And so this became a draw to Lexington for LGBTQ. And when I moved here in the 60s, I always heard that there was an exceptionally high number of LGBTQ in Lexington. I never saw the data to back it up. How could you get data on that? Nobody was talking about it back then. But that's what I was always told. And I think the horse industry had a lot to do with that.
Definitely. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about the book is the context that you place. It's very much a history of Lexington that intersects with Sweet Evening Breeze's life. And are there any other topics that I didn't ask you about or a story from the book you'd like to share that you'd really like for people to hear?
Yes, the mafia.
Okay.
The mafia connection.
Can't go wrong with that, yeah.
No, you can't go wrong with that because it's all about 224 East Main and connected to that address. And I think the real owner of that address was Frank Costello, the Don of one of New York's 5 crime families. This was the Genovese family that he rose up to the top in. And part of the Godfather movie included him, but into the character in The Godfather. But there were other people melded into that character too. But I think Frank Costello, from everything I've read about him, outwardly had a very congenial manner about him, and they called him the prime minister of the families because he tried to make peace among the 5 families. That couldn't have been an easy thing to think about doing. But the thing about the mafia was they were all about making money, and they reached far beyond New York. And in the 20s, when Prohibition was going on, they were really strong in northern Kentucky, Newport, Covington, places like that. They ran so many illegal operations there, and the police, the politicians never touched them. And northern Kentucky was infamous for its mafia presence and mafia-owned clubs up there, and so was Cleveland and Detroit, all through the Midwest, and then out to Vegas later on because the mafia built Vegas. But back to Lexington, it was a natural that the mob would look down here for some foothold because we had racehorses, and that brings gambling. And they saw opportunities here like the businessmen that they were. And my theory is that Frank Costello backed a local bookmaker named Ed Curd to open 224 East Main. It was called then the Mayfair Bar and Restaurant. Upstairs on the 2nd floor, and you can still see a 2nd floor when you drive by it today, was the Clover Club, which was the gambling operation. This club had banks of long-distance telephones and had Western Union telegraph machines clacking away. Any way they could reach out to get current information on who was winning what race anywhere in the country. It was the largest bookmaking operation in Lexington. It took a lot of money to set this place up. And Ed Curd came from, I'd say, not a wealthy youth. He's in a single mom family. They grew up on Pine Street. And next we hear from Ed Curd. He's at the Red Mile walking around taking bets, but he doesn't have a brick and mortar place. And next we hear from him. He's got a casino in northern Kentucky. How does this happen? And when next heard from, he has 224 East Main. He had somebody backing him, and I do believe it was Frank Costello because in U.S. Senate hearings against organized crime, Costello identifies Ed Kurd as his little friend down in Kentucky. They were laying off bets from New York here in Lexington. That means the bookmakers, mafia-owned bookmakers in New York, could send wagers down to Lexington to be covered if they felt like they didn't have enough money in New York to cover the wagers if those bets won. So anyway, I make an argument that Frank Costello was the real owner of 224 East Main, the Mayfair, and Ed Kurd, his man, the bookmaker, was a man about town in Lexington, and he probably thought he'd never be touched by the police, but he was taken down by then Commonwealth's attorney Jim Park, who later became a circuit judge. And yes, everybody's vulnerable, but just like so many other people, Ed Kurd had bought into the horse industry. He ended up owning Tree Haven Farm on Paris Pike, and he eventually had to sell this farm to repay liens that the IRS had on him. Because once Frank Costello in the Senate hearings identifies Ed Kurd as his little buddy in Kentucky, where he lays off bets or takes bets from Costello, just months before, Fayette County courts had essentially shut Ed Kurd down. Now the IRS arrives on the scene. I guess we didn't have an office for them in Lexington, and so I don't know where they came from, but they're on the spot. But they find 224 East Main is closed down because of what happened a few months earlier when I call him Judge Park, that's how I knew him, had successfully closed down Ed Kurd's operation as part of a huge anti-crime move here in Lexington.
Wow.
And so where does Ed Kurd go? His operation is shut down. And it was the only place gays had to go, by the way, to socialize, and I'll touch on that. Ed Kurd goes directly to Montreal, where there's a huge mob presence.
Huh.
Fascinating.
Mhm.
But what happened when they closed the Mayfair bar down? The authorities closed off all social activity affecting LGBTQ because that was the only place in Lexington that I know of that they could gather in a quality setting and meet one another and engage in friendships and build friendships. There's stories that the Zebra Bar would allow gays in. Zebra Bar, I don't think ever had quality associated with the name of, but the Mayfair had quality to it, and the LGBTQ men, who were the only ones, the women didn't go in there at the time, they dressed up in suits. And so it was a country club for them. But the authorities weren't thinking of that when they shut the place down. They were thinking of, let's end crime. And the newspaper stupidly wrote the next day after the IRS raid, Lexington police chief says he's certain that the mob did not have a presence here. I said, what? So, I mean, that whole building is a fascinating story in itself, and all the changes it went through, it's still there, still operating as a club. It turned out when it was known as the Living Room, it was the first place in Lexington that offered regular drag shows, not a once a year or something, regular drag shows. And by the way, Sweets was an early drag performer in this community.
Certainly.
And how does let me
Yes,
finish
okay.
this. How does Sweets fit into this? Because she was hanging out at 224 East Main. If you've ever been in that place, it is so tiny. You are inevitably going to rub elbows with everybody else in the place. On the first floor, when you walk in the door, before you go upstairs to the dance floor, or before you would go to the back where the drag shows are, this little front room was all it had at the time, and you were going to meet everybody in there. And I know they had to make acquaintance with Sweet Evening Breeze, just like Rock Hudson did later when it was the Gilded Cage.
Yeah. And you've really done some amazing research in your book, and there's lots of stories like the ones about Ed Kurd and Rock Hudson,
Yeah.
and it's really enjoyable and to read. And so just to kind of wrap up a little bit, where can we get a copy of your book?
Okay, it is in Joseph Beth in Lexington. It is at Black Swan Books in Lexington. Or you can go online, but please shop local before you go online.
Mhm.
You can get it directly from the publisher McFarland. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it from Barnes & Noble online. I don't know if they have it in the store, but they have it online.
Mhm.
And let's see, where else? Those are the main sources.
Okay. Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's an enjoyable read. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's been really fun.
It has been fun learning about a community I knew nothing about and learning to respect the people in that community and all the stories I came across that were fascinating. It's been a great ride.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.